thank you all for being a part of today's webinar. So we're kicking off another 4-part Basecamp series, and this series will really focus on team discovery. So team discovery lives within the design module of PI. So I would assume that most of you have access to it, or if you don't, that this is a great opportunity for you to sort of get insight into how you use that tool in the system and the benefits that it can bring for you and your team. So I'll try to make this quite interactive. So I will ask for people's input. So please feel free to just comment in the chat if you'd like. I've got the chat box open as well. And Sarah, who is on our team, is also on the call. So she'll also just be monitoring the chat box. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot them in there and answer a few of my questions that I'll be going through as well. And yeah, if you want to unmute and vocalize any of your thoughts or opinions, that's totally okay as well. So we'll kick off. So today's webinar is specifically focusing on the science behind team discovery. So sort of taking it back to the beginning to help you understand, how did PI actually come up with the concept? So how do they design and develop team discovery? And how do we actually plot people into the wheel? So what's the concept behind it? How do we link the behavioural assessment to the 4 quadrants? So to start off with, team discovery came about purely from an interest in something called the competing values framework. So that framework actually plots organisations within one of 4 quadrants based on whether they have an internal or an external focus, or whether people have the ability to work flexibly in their role, or whether they have to be quite precise in nature. So based off that framework, PI actually did a number of studies to link the behavioural assessment to these 4 quadrants. So to actually link the results that you get from your behavioural assessment to see where you would be plotted within the quadrants. So from there, we're able to actually see where we sit as individuals. So we can plot individuals into one of the 4 quadrants, but we can actually also plot teams. And this is where the power of team discovery really is. We're not necessarily looking at it just from purely an individual perspective. Where does one person sit? We actually want to look at it from a team formation perspective. So where does everyone in the team sit? Where are the similarities? Where are the gap areas? Who might actually sit a little bit differently from the rest of the group? Sometimes we have sort of like those outliers. We've got some team members who are actually quite different and who can act as like a balancer amongst the team. So trying to get all of that information. So a really, really useful tool. Now, just having a look at a few of you who are on the call, I know that with some of you have actually talked through design before. We've actually gone through team discovery, but for any of you who are still testing it out and still trialing it, we're going to dig into a little bit deeper in terms of how you plot people and what it means if you sit within certain quadrants. So there are 4 quadrants specifically. The first one, being the top left, is the teamwork and employee experience quadrant. The second one, which is the top right, is the innovation and agility quadrant. Bottom left, we've got the process and precision quadrant. And then bottom right, we've got the results and discipline quadrant. So these are the 4 headings for each of the 4 quadrants. So teamwork and employee experience, top left, innovation and agility, top right, process and precision, bottom left, and results and discipline, bottom right. So as you can imagine, based on your results, people are going to sit differently within these quadrants, and it will link actually to do with their 4 factors, which we'll just get into now. So how do we actually plot people within the quadrants? How are they actually plotted? So obviously when you do this on PI design, you don't necessarily yourself have to sit and plot people into the quadrants. The system does it for you, but it is really good to have an understanding in terms of how does that happen? How does that work? Because from that understanding, you can even start to be able to tell yourself where people should sit if you were to think about the team members that you have, or maybe even to think about yourself in terms of where you would sit. So first off, we've got the 4 factors here. So we all know the 4 factors, A being dominance, B being extroversion, C being the patience drive, and D being the formality drive. Specifically, each of these quadrants actually represent a certain factor combination. So the first factor combination that is looked at is the A and C factor combination. So looking at the action piece. So whether you are proactive, so if you have an A over C drive, or whether you are responsive, if you have a C over A factor combination. So looking at the AC. And then the second factor combination that's looked at when plotting people into the quadrants is the B and D factor combination. And that's looking at interaction. So whether you are B over D, so you're quite informal in nature, or whether you are D over B, you're formal in terms of how you prefer to communicate. So specifically, people are plotted within the quadrants based on which one of these 2 factor combinations they have. So if we were to look at the wheel, and we were to look first at sort of like the x-axis, which I've got here indicated with the red line, that specifically represents the A and C factor combination. Now, if we were to cut the wheel in half and we were to look at the right-hand side of the wheel, people who have an A over C factor combination, so people who are proactive, will sit on the right-hand side of the wheel. So that means you have a higher A dominance drive and a lower C patience drive. So anyone with that A over C factor combination will automatically sit on that right-hand side of the wheel. If we were to look at the left-hand side of the wheel, you would have that C over A factor combination. So you would be responsive. So you have a lower A drive and a higher C drive. So anyone that has that C over A factor combination will sit on the left-hand side of the wheel. So already we can start to differentiate that A over C is the right-hand side of the wheel and C over A is the left-hand side of the wheel. Now you're probably thinking, okay, what about top and bottom? So if we look at the y-axis, this is where we start to focus on the B and D factor combination. So on the upper half of the wheel, people will be plotted here if they have the B over D factor combination. So if they have the higher B drive and the lower D drive, they're going to be plotted on the upper end of the wheel. On the bottom half of the wheel, people will be plotted if they have that D over B factor combination. So if they have the lower B drive and the higher D drive, they're going to fall on the bottom half of the wheel. So this is how we start to look at in terms of how are people specifically plotted into the wheel. So we're focusing on whether they are A over C, and if they are, they're going to be on the right-hand side of the wheel. If they are C over A, they're going to be plotted on the left-hand side of the wheel. If they have a B over D factor combination, they're going to be plotted on the upper half of the wheel. And if they have a D over B factor combination, they're going to be plotted on the lower half of the wheel. So that's really the science behind how people are actually plotted. And like I mentioned, you don't have to sit and put people yourself when you're looking at the system. The system will automatically generate this when you input people's names. But it's just really good to know, how does it actually happen? How is the software actually doing and plotting people? Now, a little bit of a quiz to sort of test your knowledge as we're starting to learn about this. If a person was to have an A over C factor combination, so if they were proactive and they also had a B over D factor combination, so they were informal, where would they be plotted? Which quadrant would they be in? Would they be in the top right? Would they be in the bottom right, top left, bottom left? Which quadrant would someone with an A over C factor combination and a B over D factor combination sit in? And feel free to just pop that in the chat. More than happy to go off that. Yep, Giovanni, you've got it. Yep, top right, correct. So A over C, straight away, we know that they're going to fall on the right-hand side of the wheel, and then they've got a B over D factor combination. So they're going to sit on the top half of the wheel. So already, when we're looking at, whether you're thinking of your own profile or whether you're thinking of a team member's profile, if you were to just look at those two factor combinations, you can start to identify where they sit. So this person would sit in the top right quadrant, correct? What about if another person had a C over A factor combination? So they were responsive and they had a D over B factor combination. So they were formal. Which quadrant would they sit in? Again, would it be top right, bottom left, top left, or bottom left? Oh, I may have doubled up what I said there, but you get the gist. Bottom left, yes, Kat, Ethel, Caitlin, all correct. That person would actually sit in the bottom left quadrant. So if they have that responsive drive and they're also a bit more formal in nature, they're going to fall into that bottom left quadrant, correct? And I've just put up here just some examples of some reference profiles that may sit in these quadrants. So for example, someone who is proactive, so has that A over C factor combination, as well as that B over D factor combination being informal in nature, that could be a captain. So that's just one example. And similar, if we look at another reference profile that is C over A and D over B, could be an artisan. So again, I've just brought the profiles up and sort of the standard patterns that they can have just to show you how you can differentiate. So clearly we can see a captain, their dominance drive is way on the right and their A over C, very different to an artisan who their dominance drive is all the way on the left. So they're very clearly C over A. So you can start to see that based on the pattern, the behavioral pattern that a person has, they're going to be plotted a little bit differently everywhere. Now, hopefully that made sense for everyone. I know that that was quite a little bit almost mathematical, really getting into the science of how you actually plot individuals. So next up, I think it's really important to actually understand, what does each quadrant mean? What do we mean by if you sit in the teamwork and employee experience quadrant or the innovation and agility and so forth? So going to dig deeper a little bit into each quadrant. So to start off with, the top left quadrant, when we're looking at teamwork and employee experience, if you sit in this quadrant, or your team members, if they were to sit in this quadrant, would be referred to as cultivating leaders. And that's because people who typically sit in this top left quadrant are quite supportive, very collaborative in nature, and really open and transparent when it comes to communication. So for them, opportunities to work together and to be collaborative will be really important. You've got your team players who are sitting here, thus the name teamwork. So they'll really want to work with and through others. They'll also be quite people first when it comes to making decisions. So they're going to make decisions based on team consensus. So what do others think, as well as how might that actually impact our stakeholders? How might that impact our customers? Really having that people orientation in mind. They'll be really frequent with their communication style, so they'll be quite open and really willing to connect with others. Now, one thing is they will want to avoid conflict. So being that they're such team players, for them, conflict is something that they would be uncomfortable with. So having any type of difficult conversations with a team member will be a little bit tricky, and they might need a bit of support when it comes to that. They'll really be focused on the well-being of the team and making sure that morale is high. So those are the type of people who would sit in that top left quadrant. So you can already start to think that these people would have a higher B, extroversion drive. We're talking about wanting to communicate and being open with others. They want to collaborate. So naturally, they probably have a lower A drive, a lower dominance drive. So those type of people are going to sit in your teamwork and employee experience. Does anyone want to pop in the chat some reference profiles that come to mind now that we've gone through the type of behaviors that a person would have in the teamwork and employee experience quadrant? What reference profiles do you think would sit within that quadrant? And again, feel free to just pop it into the chat. So thinking of someone who has a high B drive, high extroversion, a lower A drive, so a lower dominance drive, what type of patterns might it be? Again, testing a little bit your PI knowledge. You might think of someone in your team who might be showing some of these attributes. Ethel, great. Yep, you've got collaborator, which is one, and you've also got guardian, which guardian would sit partly in the sense of that guardians do have that lower A drive, but they also have a lower B drive. So they wouldn't exactly sit in the teamwork and employee experience, but a collaborator most definitely does. So you would typically find people within this quadrant, people who are promoters and collaborators. And coincidentally, I'm a promoter and Sarah is a collaborator. So if you were to plot us into one of the 4 quadrants, we're going to sit into the teamwork and employee experience quadrant. So moving on next to, I want my shared reference profiles, to that innovation and agility quadrant. So now looking at what we would call your exploring leaders. So these people are really open to risk. Will have big ideas and want to talk out those ideas. So they're quite innovative in terms of their approach, and really enjoy having that rapid exchange of thoughts, opinions, and really getting it all out of their mind. They're going to think quite boldly. So like I said, they're going to be quite innovative. They're going to be thinking big picture. How can we do things better? How can we improve? What new products can we offer? What new services can we give to our customers? And are really going to solve problems through innovation and through the ideas that they're formulating. They will also really relish change. For them, change is quite comfortable. It will come quite naturally for them, and they're going to be risk-taking. So with those ideas, they're going to be quite quick to make decisions. So an idea that they have today could quite literally start, the wheels can start going into motion next week. They're really quick on making a decision about whether or not they should do something. So really decisive, not taking a lot of time to think things through, and maybe not looking at every aspect in terms of the detail and the data that's available. So those are your type of people who are going to sit in that innovation and agility quadrant. So really big picture thinkers, focus on the future and really thinking out loud in terms of their ideas. Any suggestions in terms of what reference profiles might sit in this innovation and agility quadrant? So again, thinking that these people like to talk it out, so they probably have a higher B extroversion drive. They're quite risk-taking, so that would tell me that they have a lower formality drive. Yes, I love the answers have come through for this one, which tells me either you would sit in this quadrant or you know someone who most definitely sits in this quadrant. Yes, we've got people saying maverick, captains, venturers. That is all correct. So you would get all these reference profiles. A persuader would sit in here as well. Your maverick would sit here, captain and venturer. So these are people who have a higher dominance drive, so quite independent in the way that they work. Giovanni's put the best quadrant. And I think Alicia would agree with you there, Giovanni. But really big picture thinkers. So they've got that independence drive to put their ideas out there, really social, but have that lower formality drive because they've got that risk-taking approach to the way that they work. Fantastic. Thanks for your suggestions, everyone. Looking now at the bottom left, that's the process and precision quadrant. And here are your stabilizing leaders. So these are going to be the people in your team who are really well organized, coordinated, and actually a little bit more protective of risk. So they're going to protect the team from risk or protect the business. And that just might mean that they're a bit more focused on the data and the evidence and the research before they make decisions. So they're going to be quite thorough when it comes to problem solving and really focus in on that in-depth analysis. So for them, they're going to have that analytical and technical mindset. They're also going to have a really high focus on quality. For them, quality is of utmost importance, and making sure that things are running efficiently, smoothly. So how can they streamline processes to make things even run quicker and better? They will also be really predictable and stable. So thinking these type of people will probably enjoy routine, will enjoy doing repetitive tasks, and they will prefer to focus on a few well-defined objectives. So what that means is thinking of, okay, what needs to be done now? What task can I focus on? They'll want to complete that task before moving on to the next. So really focusing in on a couple things to get it done right, rather than being a person who would have multiple priorities going on at once. So those are your stabilizing leaders who sit in that process and precision quadrant. So again, I'll put it out there to everyone. Any ideas on what reference profiles would sit within the process and precision quadrant? So probably starting to think that they might have that higher C drive, so that patience drive. They might also have a higher formality drive. Yep, Ethel, great. You've got operator, you've put in craftsman, which has now actually just changed to artisan. So I'll just quickly mention that craftsman's actually been replaced by the name artisan, just to make it more general, neutral, and specialist. So yes, Ethel, you got all of those there, as well as operator. So those type of profiles will all sit in that process and precision quadrant. Alrighty, and finally, we've got the results and discipline quadrant. So this is where you have your producing leaders. So they'll have some similarities to your process and precision team members in the sense of they will also like structure, and they'll have quite a high focus on rules and details. But where they'll be a little bit different is they'll actually have a bit more of that proactive nature to them, and will feel quite comfortable working independently. So they'll be able to solve problems both independently and in a team when needed, but with real focus and clarity. And for them, like the title suggests, decisions will be made with results in mind. So for them, it's how can we be efficient and ensure that we're getting the results for the team. So still quite driven to reach objectives, and we'll still make sure that everything's done accurately and to a high quality. What reference profiles do we think might fit into the results and discipline category? Which ones? We've still got a few left. Kat, yep, you've said scholar. A scholar would sit in the results and discipline, yes. Any other ideas? Strategist, yes, perfect. So you're going to have strategists, your analyzers, your controllers, some of those gear background reference profiles, as well as your scholar. They're all going to sit within that results and discipline quadrant. That's because they've got a little bit more of that higher A drive. So the dominance drive is a bit higher than the people who would sit in that process and precision, but they would still have that really high formality drive as well. So that's just a good sort of overview in terms of what it means when people sit within each of these 4 quadrants. And I'm sure that you could probably start to think of certain roles that would suit each quadrant. But where team discovery is really interesting is when you actually do the team formation, you see where your team sits and you see, okay, where do the majority lie? And you actually compare that to your objectives and you compare that to your strategy. And we'll go into that in more detail next week when we start to focus on strategic mapping your team and mapping them to the objectives. Is even though you might have a team that sits in that process and precision quadrant, for example, they can't always, in terms of, every day of the year, only work within that quadrant. There will most definitely be times where they'll have to flex and meet the needs within other quadrants. So that's why it's just really great to have an understanding, okay, innately, what is this team's preference? How are they going to behave? How are they going to work as a group? Do I have people that sit differently that might bring in something else to the team? And then also looking at it from that perspective of, okay, they actually need to flex. How am I going to support them to do that? Who should lead the project? Those type of questions, which we'll get into a little bit more. Now, you may have noticed that there are a couple profiles missing from the slide here. Kat, you mentioned one, you popped in individualist, and there are 3 profiles that we call flexes, and one of them is actually the individualist. Another one is the adapter as well as the altruist. So these 3 reference profiles are actually a little bit harder to predict where they would sit. We can't do what we just did before and say that they would definitely be in this quadrant. Depending on the person's behavioral pattern, they can actually flex and sit across more than one quadrant. So they've got the ability, obviously, depending on the situation and the environment that they're in, to adapt. So just to give you a little bit of an example, if we were to look specifically at the adapter, so everyone probably knows an adapter has quite a narrow, skinny profile, not wide at all. But interestingly enough, an adapter still does have factor combinations, very narrow factor combinations, but they do exist. So if you were to look, I've got the behavioral pattern here on the screen, and again, feel free to just pop it in the chat. Does this adapter have a over C factor combination, or do they have a C over A factor combination? When we're looking at this behavioral pattern, are they A over C or C over A? C over A, perfect. Yes, they are C over A. You can clearly see that the C is on the right-hand side and the A is more on the left-hand side of the midpoint. Great. Does this person have a B over D factor combination or a D over B factor combination? Are they B over D or D over B? Yep, correct. D over B. So again, we can start to think, okay, what do we know about how they will be plotted into the graph? So we know that if they are C over A, which everyone mentioned before, they're going to sit on the left-hand side of the wheel. And if they are D over B, they're going to sit on the bottom half of the wheel. So this person would actually be plotted within the process and precision quadrant as an adapter. Now let's compare and let's look at another adapter. So again, same reference profile, but this is why people's behavioral patterns are so important, because this is where we get into the nitty gritty. How are they actually going to behave? So now I've got a second profile up on the screen, just on the right-hand side. Does this new adapter, are they A over C or are they C over A? Which factor combination do they have there? A over C or C over A? A over C, perfect. So if they are A over C, are they going to sit on the right-hand side of the wheel or the left-hand side of the wheel? So taking it a step further there, if they're A over C, they're going to sit on the right-hand side. Great. Does this adapter have a B over D factor combination or a D over B factor combination? Yes, so they are B over D. So their B drive is slightly more to the right. So they're B over D. So does that mean they're going to sit on the top half of the wheel or the bottom half of the wheel? They're going to be up the top or the bottom if they have this B over D factor combination. Perfect. Top. That's great. It looks like everyone is getting how you plot people. So this person has an A over C factor combination as well as a B over D. So they're going to sit on the right-hand side on the top. So they're going to sit within that innovation and agility quadrant. So that's just to give you a little bit of an example about how those 3 profiles can flex depending on the specific pattern that they have. Very similar with an individualist and an altruist. A certain factor can be different depending on the pattern. And so that obviously will change which quadrant they will be in. But no, that was just really good, a little bit to test just your identification of factor combinations and which part of the quadrants it would be in. So thanks everyone. Alrighty, so Like I sort of was mentioning before, depending on where you sit, there will be naturally a little bit of a flex that you can do and that is okay with you. So for example, if you were to sit in the innovation and agility quadrant in the top right, you will feel comfortable to flex across. So to flex into that teamwork and employee experience quadrant. And that would make sense because both your innovation and agility and your teamwork and employee experience have people with a higher extroversion drive. So naturally, even people who are big picture thinkers can still think about the employee experience or still think about the customer journey and how they can help strengthen that. Similar with people who might sit in that process and precision, like what I was mentioning before, they too can flex and vice versa into that results and discipline quadrant, and results and discipline can flex into that process and precision because they've got that level of detail to them. They've got that accuracy piece and that quality. So they'll be able to naturally at times, depending on the situation, flex across. So what we always say is being able to flex across or up or down is okay. Now, again, it does depend on the situation. It does depend on the team environment, but it is a little bit easier to do. And I'm sure that if you're thinking about your own reference profile, and you might, be able now to tell which quadrant you would sit in, if you were to look in terms of across or bottom, top, and think, okay, yes, has there been times where I've actually have had to flex into that quadrant? Maybe your team's objectives have required you to, and you can start to think of a scenario where that's happened. Now, where it gets a little bit more difficult is stretching across. So it's very hard, for example, for people who sit within the process and precision quadrant to flex diagonally into that innovation and agility quadrant, and vice versa. Similar, it'll be really difficult for someone who sits in that team and employee experience quadrant to flex across into that results and discipline, and vice versa. Now, this is where I would say the juicy bit of team discovery comes out, because you would be very surprised that when you put your teams through team discovery and you start to see where they sit, and then you link it with the objectives, more often than not, your objectives actually sit diagonally from where the team is situated. So for example, I went through with someone, they had a team who was predominantly in the process and precision quadrant with 2 people across the results and discipline. So really focused on process, really focused on structure, definitely wanted to do high quality work. But they were currently all working within a business that was only a couple of years old, so it's still quite new. And their objectives actually sat in the innovation and agility quadrant in terms of having to start up new ideas, break into new markets. Can anyone give me any ideas on what they think would have happened with this team? So this team is working in process and precision, but their objectives are within innovation and agility. Do you think that they were able to meet those objectives easily? Are they top of the list? Or do you think that they would fall more down towards the bottom? What's people's thoughts there? Just again, you might have an experience that you might be able to share as well. But yeah, how do you think people who are quite detail orientated, do you think it'll be easy for them to flex into talking about new ideas or branching out into new markets? And again, feel free to just pop your answer in the chat. I'll just give everyone a second. Giovanni, you've popped a question in, so I think we've got a little bit of time. I can actually go through that just while some people start to think about my question and pop some answers in. So Giovanni's just popped in, how does it affect the hierarchical relationships? Is it difficult? Is it a difficult relationship between an exploring leader and a stabilizing manager who reports into him or her? That's a really good question, Giovanni. It definitely, again, depends on the awareness that each person has. So if you've got an exploring leader, naturally, they're going to be, like I said, big picture thinker. So they're going to be moving really quickly, quite rapidly, have lots of new ideas in mind that they want to implement. Now, if you have a stabilizing leader, or let's say your manager's that stabilizing manager, they're going to be a little bit more cautious when it comes to change. They're going to want to go through the data and the facts and make sure things are correct before they actually implement the change. So it would be really important that this exploring leader actually gives all the information to the stabilizing manager. So you would have to be quite detailed in your information. You'd have to come ready with all the data and evidence, or you'd have to give them time to do the research themselves to go with the decision. That will be really important, the communication piece, explaining the why that something should happen, and also giving them a bit of time to adapt to the change. So even though exploring leaders will feel very comfortable to switch to a new process tomorrow, your stabilizing manager, that will actually disrupt their workflow. That would actually cause a lot of stress and tension. So it's best to give them some time to implement what needs to happen and to understand the why. So again, that's why it's so crucial, having this awareness of where you sit. What does that mean? How do I need to flex and adapt my natural behaviors depending on who I'm talking to? We did have some responses back. Thank you, Kat. You did put here team members will underperform and feel demotivated for not reaching the goal. That's a really good point. If you have the objective sitting across the quadrant where people are all based in, they may not be achieving their goals and targets. And obviously through not meeting those expectations, they may feel demotivated. You might have a lack of engagement happening. And remembering that people who have a high D drive, so who are have that high formality drive, they're subject matter experts. So people who sit in process and precision want to be good at their job. So if they're not meeting their requirements, they probably will feel demotivated. So I think that's a really good point there that you've put, Kat. It could also push team members to twilight zone where both parties are not meeting their expectations correct, especially if you're not having communication amongst groups, if there's a bit of that cross collaboration happening. Perfect. Any other thoughts or questions in terms of people's ability to flex or stretch across quadrants, or what it might mean if you're working with a team who is maybe a little bit different to each other? More than happy if anyone has any questions to pop it through in the chat so we can talk through. But really, yes, I think after today's session, what I would say would be really great is to actually, if you've got access to team discoveries, to go on, put a team in, see where the team formation is. And I might actually just go back to this slide before in terms of, do you have a team that is quite bottom heavy, top heavy? Do they all sit within one quadrant? Are they actually quite spread out? Do you have people that sit across multiple quadrants? And again, you might have a team that you've got certain people within one quadrant, other people within other quadrants. That sort of links to what Giovanni was saying. Having that awareness, or yourself as a manager, to be able to adapt your style to your team members depending on where they sit, and to also be able to share that information with other people and with those team members would also be really important, because a lot of the time it's just that communication piece that helps open up doors. It also helps people understand why others work the way they do. So if I was to even link it back to Giovanni's question, if you had the stabilizing manager who didn't understand the exploring leader in the sense of they didn't know that they feel really comfortable with change, and that's why they're constantly giving them new ideas and new systems to implement, it's sort of, not helping that relationship might make them be a little bit more stressed out. But if they do have that understanding of, hey, my manager is actually quite innovative, loves to talk ideas out, maybe I just need to say to them that I actually need a bit more data and information and a little bit more time, and then we can come back and collaborate on the idea. So it's just opening up that communications piece to be able to understand how people prefer to work and how you as a manager can best lead your team, especially if you have people who sit within a certain quadrant, or how you can adapt if you've got different styles within the group. Perfect. Well, we've hit time pretty much. More than happy to answer any questions. If anyone wants to stay on the chat and ask a specific question, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, thank you everyone so much for joining today. Hopefully that was insightful. Next week, we will be going through team types. So we're actually going to start to look at more specifically team formation and what that means when certain teams see within certain quadrants. So thank you everyone, and yeah, looking forward to seeing you again next week.